To speak proficient English for the past at a C2 English level, you need to use more than just the basics. You need to know all of these. If you see something on this list and you're not sure about it, watch this video because I'm going to go through all of these advanced features of English in the past in 20 short lessons, and I will help you reach a higher English level. Lesson 20 is for the habitual past habits and routines. Now, we're familiar with three methods for this: used to, would, and the past simple. But there are actually 6 methods. We can also use the present perfect, the past continuous, and the past perfect to speak about habits in the past. Let's recap the basics before we go on to the advanced features. First of all, used to. For example, I used to sing in a choir. I used to be a singer. We use used to for past habits, routines, and descriptions that are no longer true, and there's a sense of it being a long time ago. Would is also used for past habits and routines. So you could say, I would sing in a choir every day. But we don't use would for descriptions. There's again a sense of it being a long time ago. And we can also use the past simple. For example, I sang in a choir weekly, or I was a singer. So we can use the past simple for habits, routines, and descriptions. But here we need extra language to show it's a habit. If we didn't use the word weekly, we wouldn't have known that singing in a choir was a habit. Also, there's no particular sense of it being a long time ago. This could be something quite recent. Less commonly taught is the present perfect for habits. For example, I have sung in a choir every day since 2020. What's different about the present perfect for habits is that they are still true. I have sung since 2020 and I'm still doing it now. It's also told in the context of the present. What are you doing now? Oh, I sing in a choir. I have sung in this choir since 2020. Another way of describing past habits is through the past continuous. For example, I was always singing when I was younger. So this is for past repeated activities that are no longer true, but we need adverbs of frequency such as always to use the past continuous in this way. And finally, the past perfect. For example, I had sung in a choir before the group folded. Again, the past perfect can be used with habits, routines, or descriptions, but what's important here is it must have ended before the time of the story that you're trying to tell. Lesson 19 is making progress with ideas. How do we do this? Well, compare these two sentences. Firstly, I ate breakfast and I brushed my teeth. Secondly, I was eating my breakfast and I was brushing my teeth. Both sentences are grammatically correct, but only one has the correct meaning here. First of all, let's look at the past simple sentence. I ate breakfast and I brushed my teeth. This works well because first I ate my breakfast, then afterwards I brushed my teeth. The past simple gives us the sense that time can move forward. When we have a list of events in the past simple, normally the oldest one comes first and the newest one comes last. However, we can't do this with the past continuous. With the past continuous, time stays where it is, and therefore the past continuous sentence does not make sense here. I was eating my breakfast and I was brushing my teeth. With the past continuous, there is nothing to make time move forward. Therefore, the listener thinks these are two things happening at the same time, which is not possible. You cannot eat your breakfast and brush your teeth at the same time. But without extra language or using the past simple, we cannot move time forward with the past continuous. So if you want to make progression in a story, you need to use the past simple or time phrases. You cannot simply list past continuous events one after the other because the past continuous keeps events at the same time. Lesson 18 is use past adjectives to avoid the past tense. What do I mean? Well, compare these two sentences here. There was another chairperson before the new chairperson. They are both at the meeting. Then the previous chairperson and the new chairperson are at the meeting. The first set of sentences uses the past tense, but in the second sentence we've replaced the past tense with an adjective that describes the past. So the adjective previous communicates the past situation without any need for the past tense at all. What's the benefit of this? Well, it means that the story can now focus on the present situation. Other past adjectives include prior, which means the one before, former means previous, bygone, from a long time ago, preceding also means the one before, aforementioned means mentioned before, and one time means this was true at a past time. Lesson 17 is the historical present. Look at this story here. It's the first day of school. Everyone looks so big. The teacher seems scary. The other children look anxious about what they must do next. That was 10 years ago. Now school is fun. This is very common writing style in novels or newspaper articles, but notice we've used the present tense here in a past tense story. So we use the present simple in a past story to do these things. We help the listener visualize the experience. If you recount an experience using the present tense, it makes the listener imagine in their mind that they are there. They think about it as if it was happening now, and that helps them get closer to the experience. Also, it makes it feel more real. Remember, the present simple is the tense for facts. So if you say something in the present simple, it makes it feel more factual or real. You don't want to do this every time you speak in the past, though. It's quite rare to use the historical present, so you need to choose the right moment. Normally, you might use it to highlight key points from a story, not every part. Lesson 16 is future in the past. Sometimes when we're speaking about the past, we want to talk about events that happen a little bit after the time of the story, but before now. And we have special ways of doing that. Let's look at this first part of a story. She worked really hard that year. She would win an award for the best essay at the end of the year. So notice here we've used the word would. Would is for situations and activities to come after the time of the story. Look at the time expressed in the first sentence. She worked really hard that year. So here we're talking about the year in general. But the next sentence talks about something right at the end of the year. So it's after the time of the story in the first sentence. But what happens by using would, we're kind of looking forward from our time in the story into a time in the future. But we're not coming up to the present. So would is really good to do that. We can also use was or were going to in a similar way. Look how the story continues. She was going to start university, but then she got a job. So here, was going to introduces an activity to come after this particular time in the story. Now, what's different about was and were going to is we often use this with activities that do not eventually happen. So she was going to start university, but she didn't. She got a job instead. Thirdly, we can use the past continuous. She was planning to start on the first day of the following year, but she missed the bus. Here, we are talking about a planned activity for after the time of the story. It's similar to the present continuous, which we use for future events after the present. The past continuous can be used for events after in the future compared to a point in the past. And finally, the present simple. The timetable said it left at 9 a.m, but on that day it left at 8 a.m. So 9 a.m. was the timetabled time, but of course this was going to be in the future. The 9 o'clock was after when she was thinking. She looked at the timetable, it said 9 o'clock, that's when the bus was due to arrive. So we can use the past simple for timetable events happening after the time of the story. And if you want to take a longer course studying these advanced issues, which contains lessons, exercises and PDFs, then click on the link in the description for my advanced English grammar course for C1 and C2 English learners. This is useful if you only particularly want to focus on the most advanced aspects of English, or the aspects of English that cause problems to advanced learners, even if they've been learnt a long time before. Lesson 15 is past modality. This is when we use modal verbs in the past. In general, we use the word have to indicate the past with a modal verb, but not always. Here are the common ones. The first set is when we are speculating using logical deduction. So in response to a question, why did she go out? You could answer in these ways. She might have gone for a run. She may have been asked out for coffee. She could have needed to go shopping. She must have heard about the emergency. So might, may, could and must all work with speculating or logical deduction. Might, may and could are possibilities. Must is when something is far more likely to be the true answer. We can also use have with should, ought and would when we are being more hypothetical or looking back to perhaps what should have happened or an option that was not taken but was preferable. So he should have taken an umbrella. He ought to have listened to me. He wouldn't have got wet if it had been dry. These are all follow-on sentences to the previous sentence, he went out in the rain. But all of these uses of have indicate the past tense with a modal. And notice that have here does not necessarily indicate the present perfect. It can be for any past time. You can add yesterday or last year or any time frame to any of these sentences. But there are some exceptions. Firstly, with semi-modals, where you have modals that are made of two words. Now, these can change into the past tense. I had to go out to pick up my children. I needed to get some fresh air. Also, could and would do not have to use have. They have two past forms. They have could followed by have and could without have. Would followed by have and would without have. With would, we're talking about the future in the past when we don't use have, which we explained in the previous lesson. With could, we're speaking about past ability in general. For example, I could run for an hour when I was younger. 14 is having followed by the past participle. For example, having chosen a new book at the library, I started reading it the next day. So here we've used having to create an alternative for the first sentence below. You could have said, I chose a new book at the library. I started reading it the next day. But here we have two sentences. The connection is fairly clear, but we can make the connection even clearer by using having, and therefore we can incorporate them as two clauses together. So instead of I chose a new book, we can say having chosen a new book at the library, I started reading it the next day. Having indicates very clearly that the first thing leads to the second thing in the past. 13 is participle phrases. For example, concerned with the impact of his heavy smoking, she asked him to give the habit up. Here, this is an alternative for she was concerned about the impact of his heavy smoking. Therefore, she asked him to give the habit up. Again, as with the lesson with having, what we're doing here is we're taking two independent sentences and making a closer connection between the two. But the technique here is different. Because the subject is the same in both sentences, we can delete the subject from the first sentence, turn it into a participle, concerned, and then turn that into a phrase which introduces the second part of the sentence. And because they're in the same sentence, there is a much stronger sense of connection between the two. Number 12 is when the past is used, but we actually mean the present or the future. This tends to happen when we are being hypothetical. For example, I wish you were happy. You're not actually happy, but this is my desire. And we use the past to show it's unreal. But it refers to the present or the future. We're not talking about the past. Similarly, supposing you won a lot of money, would you be happy? So here, supposing makes it an unreal situation, imagining. Have you got a lot of money? No, but we're imagining that you have. But here, one is actually referring to the present or the future. Now we're going to look at some particular phrases that commonly go with a particular tense. Which tense do you think this one goes with? This is the. Look at the example. This is the first time I have been to this restaurant. You'll notice here that we've used the present perfect. But the structure that comes before is this is the followed by an ordinal. So a numerical value. This is the first time. This is the second stage. This is the 8th occasion. When you have a phrase like that, we commonly use the present perfect to finish it off, even though it started with the present simple. You will find some exceptions to this, but it's very common that you use the present perfect in response to a phrase like this. Lesson 10 is to do with time shifting. And this is a really important lesson to learn to understand the principles of why English speakers use the present perfect and the past perfect. Let me take you through an example. Up to now, you've seen the statues, you've visited the museum, and you've been on a boat trip. What do you want to do next? Now look at this passage with some colours added. The red words refer perhaps more to present situations, now. What do you want to do? The blue words refer to things clearly in the past. You've seen the statues, you've visited the museum, you've been on a boat trip. All of those things happened before the present. So why did we use the present perfect here in a present tense story? Well, the key is that the person speaking wants to maintain the time of the story in the present. The key thing here is, what do you want to do next? I'm talking about a decision that I want you to make now. But I'm giving some context that will help us make that present decision. And the context are the things done earlier in the day. Now, rather than use the past simple for these past events, we use the present perfect. You've seen the statues, you've visited the museum, you've been on a boat trip. And by using the present perfect, we maintain that focus on the present. We're saying to the listener, these are all things that happened in the past, but I'm connecting them to my story now. If I was to use the past simple, then I would be taking the listener out of my present situation and taking them into my past situation. If I said, you saw the statues, you visited the museum, you went on a boat trip, we are focusing the reader's mind back in the past. But if we say, you've seen the statues, you've visited the museum, and you've been on a boat trip, we are focusing the listener's attention on now. This is a really important consideration when you're deciding whether to use the present perfect or the past simple. Do you want the listener to focus on the present, or do you want the listener to focus on the past? If you want them to focus on the present, then we need to use time shifting through the present perfect. It means we're speaking about a particular time, but we shift attention backwards whilst maintaining the time of the story. It's similar with the past perfect, where you would have a story at a moment in the past. You want to keep in that moment in the past, but you also want to introduce things that happened before in the context of that moment in the past, when you would use the past perfect to do so. Number 9 is distancing. Distancing involves creating space in language, and we can do that using the past tenses. But why would we do that? Let's look at these two examples here. Please help me. I was wondering if you might help me. The second one has more distancing than the first one because it uses the past tense, and the past tense puts distance in the request in terms of time and reality. The effect is to be more formal and more polite. Lesson 8 is connecting events in the past. Look at this passage first. The leader shouted instructions to the team. The team began to follow the instructions. So you'll remember earlier in this video, I spoke about using the past simple to progress time. But here we also use the past simple to connect events. The team leader shouted instructions. The effect of that was the team began to follow the instructions. So as well as showing progression in time, we're showing a connection, one thing to another. However, consider what happens if you use the past continuous. The leader was shouting instructions to the team. The team were beginning to follow the instructions. Now, as well as the past continuous not being able to progress time, it does not connect to independent events either. So it creates a problem here. Whilst the past simple does connect the events and is appropriate here, the past continuous does not. And because it does not connect the two events, it makes the listener think that the two events are simply incidental. It was a coincidence that they happened at the same time. Perhaps on one side of the building site, the leader was shouting instructions to a team. And then on the other side, at exactly the same time, a different team were beginning to follow the instructions. The two things were happening at the same time. There was no connection between the two. We're looking at specific uses of language again for lesson 7, and this is the difference between this and that. This is the best day of my life. Or that was the best day of my life. Why would we use one or the other? Well, this represents the idea of something being near. We have the idea of this being near in terms of geography, but it also works in terms of time as well. This often goes with a present tense. This is the best day of my life. But that has the meaning of far, and therefore that often goes with the past tense. That was the best day of my life. Now, It doesn't always work perfectly like this. If you are referring to something in the distance, in the present, for example, you'd still say that is perhaps the nearest mountain. You see it in the distance, so you use that to be far in terms of distance. But if there's no need for that and you're referring to time and time alone, it's much more common to say that was. 6 is past inversion. Inversion is where you change the order of words to create emphasis, and we can do this with past time in a few ways. First of all, with conditionals. For example, if you entered the competition, you'd probably win. Now, we can make the first sentence inverted in the following way. Were you to enter the competition, you'd probably win. It has the same meaning, but we've changed the order of words so that you comes after were instead of if here. What we've done is we've created were as an auxiliary verb, and then because were comes at the beginning and takes the tense, enter does not take the tense. Now it becomes to plus infinitive. Another way of doing this with a conditional is with had, the past perfect. If you had gone to the museum, you would have seen the fossils. Using inversion, we can say, had you gone to the museum, you would have seen the fossils. Now here we have an auxiliary already, had. So now had goes to the beginning of the sentence and you goes after it. Gone remains in the past participle, but it's a way of creating inversion in a conditional which is in the past. Another technique for past inversion is negative inversion. For example, I have never won a competition. We can invert this. Never have I won a competition. And the purpose of inversion is simply to create more emphasis. But we can do it in a past way like this. Number 5 is past ideas that are no longer true. For instance, hundreds of years ago, people thought the world was flat. Now, why did I use was here? I used was because I'm using the past tense to show an idea is no longer true. Well, I think for most people, it's no longer true. Compared to this, though, scientists claim that the world is round. Now, here we use the present tense to show an idea is still considered true. If scientists thought the opposite now, then you would have said scientists claimed that the world was round. But because the scientists found this out in the last perhaps 100, 200 years, and they still think the same, use the present tense to emphasize the fact that it's still considered true. Lesson 4 covers a common mistake that is made by many speakers of particular native languages. And that relates to this. Use perfect tenses for how long something has been going on for. Look at this question and the answer. What are you doing? I am trying to solve this puzzle. I have been trying to finish it for a week. Now, it's tempting because the first part of the answer is in the present continuous. I am trying to solve this puzzle. When you go on to talk about the time period involved, it's tempting to continue with the present continuous and say, I am trying to finish it for a week. But this is not correct. The correct way to do this is to use the present perfect, because the present perfect says how long, even though the context is still the present simple or the present continuous. If you did use the present continuous here and say, I am trying to finish it for a week, then that is referring either to the situation in progress, perhaps you started yesterday and you're going to finish 6 days after today, Or you're referring entirely to the future. You're going to set aside 1 week to finish this starting now. But if you want to refer to something where you started in the past and the period of time taken continues up to now, how long something has been going on for, then you need to use the present perfect. Number 3 is use the past tense when beliefs are confirmed or disproved. Look at the example here. Who said this would be an easy test? It is much harder than I expected. Let me draw your attention to the tenses here. So in green, it is much harder. That's present simple. And then in red, than I expected, that's past simple. So although we introduce the situation now in the present, it is much harder. When we refer to the belief that we had, whether it was confirmed or disproved, we revert back to the past. It is much harder than I expected, by which I mean before the time I started. 2 is tense simplification. Look at the example here. I started a new business in 2019. I had closed the previous business because no one was buying its products. Now, look at the words in the colours here. We have the past perfect, I had closed, but then an extra activity which is at the same time as the event in the past perfect. I had closed the previous business because no one was buying its products. Which seems strange because we expect in one way to use the past perfect because it's at the same time as the other event in the past perfect. And you can do that. But under the rules of tense simplification, once the past perfect time is established, subordinate clauses with further concurrent events, that means events happening at the same time, can be expressed in the past simple or past continuous. It's the principle of making the tenses simpler. Once we already know what the time event is, do not add another past perfect phrase or clause in the same sentence if it's not necessary to cover the meaning. The danger of using another past perfect clause here is that you think that the next clause is even further back than the first clause. So using the past continuous makes much more sense here than using the past perfect again. And the final point is US and UK differences. In other words, American English and British English. One of the things that causes a lot of confusion with the present perfect is that Americans tend to do slightly different things to the British with the present perfect. So you may read about the present perfect in a course book, but then go and watch a movie and hear someone using the present perfect or the past simple in a different way. So here is the key thing that you need to be aware of. Look at the difference in the response to this question. Why can't you get in your house? Is it I've lost my keys or I lost my keys? Well, it depends whether it's American English or British English. British English will tend to use the present perfect, I've lost my keys, because it's an action that affected the present question. We're talking about getting into the house now, so it affects now. But American English will typically, not always, but typically use the past simple to emphasize the fact that I lost my keys finished before now. It's also noteworthy that when you have phrases such as already, yet, or just, American English will sometimes use the past simple with these phrases. The key thing is when you want to emphasize something is finished and not carrying on up to now. These are guidance issues. They're not necessarily rules. But it's useful for you to know so you don't run into confusion when you're listening to people who use the present perfect and the past simple in a slightly different way to how you've been taught.